All right, so I've explained kind of the mechanisms of classical conditioning, but let's talk about how you actually come to make that pairing between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus so that ultimately the neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus. All right, I'm going to turn off the microphone on the system because I think that makes my regular microphone too quiet. So I'm going to come back here. All right. All right, so acquisition. So first off, timing is really critical. The neutral stimulus must appear before the unconditioned stimulus. So you have to ring the bell before you present the dog food. If you don't present the neutral stimulus first, the dog is already eating the dog food and hears a bell. The bell's not predicting anything. The neutral stimulus must be in the position of predicting the unconditioned stimulus in order for the learner to make the association. So it's really super important that neutral stimulus comes first, followed by unconditioned stimulus, so that the learner can make that association. All right. Another principle of acquisition is really how can we make that response go away? How can we break the association between what is now the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus? So during acquisition, we present the bell first, followed by the food. Once we get to the point where the dog in this case is drooling just as much to the bell as they have been to the food, we will say that the dog has acquired the association. Now, to make that association go away, we want to do a process called extinction. We want to extinguish the response. So what we're going to do is repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus by itself. So we keep ringing the bell with no food following it. So that ultimately the learner comes to understand that the conditioned stimulus no longer means anything. It's gone back to a neutral stimulus. Well, that's really neat, except for Pavlov quickly discovered that once you've extinguished a classically conditioned response, if you let some amount of time pass, in this diagram it's illustrated as just this pause, and then present the conditioned stimulus by itself again, you'll get a small spontaneous recovery of that response. So that with no further training, nothing else has happened. We thought, extinguished the association. But let a little bit of time pass, present that conditioned stimulus alone, you'll get a little bit of a reaction, about half the size, a third of the size of the last reaction. So that implies that the learner has really made this association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and that with the passage of time, they think that that association may have reformed, that it may again be relevant. And you can imagine how useful that is, right? That you might have the bell ring, the food presented, the bell ring, the food presented, the bell rings, and actually they're feeding the dogs in the neighboring kennel. So that bell, I heard it, I got excited, I thought it was for me, but nope, they were feeding the dogs in the neighboring kennel. So you can imagine that sometimes there will be times when the conditioned stimulus is not going to be followed by the unconditioned stimulus. And so when you hear the next time, you may think, oh good, they're feeding me now. Yay, it's my turn. And you respond again because you're like, maybe we're back to the bell predicting the food. Maybe it's meaningful again. And so you drool again in excitement and anticipation. So the fact that we see this spontaneous recovery really shows us that the learner has made a really strong association, that it wasn't transitory, that it wasn't just luck or something like that, but more like it's very deeply seated when they make these associations. So I wanted to stop here and give us a little bit of an example that's more human and less dog food based. So let's use an example of a very complicated human behavior. Like, let's imagine a child who was raised by an alcoholic parent, who, when the parent drinks a lot, becomes aggressive or violent. So the child over time sees the parent drinking and has then had sometimes that followed by some kind of abuse. Some kind of bad thing happens to the child. So that pretty soon when they see the parent drinking, they are reacting to that just as strongly, just as fearfully as if the parent was actually acting aggressive right now. So they've got this really strong, classically conditioned association between alcohol consumption and then violent behavior. Now imagine that the child grows up and distances themselves from the parents somehow. They go off to the military or to college or something like that, and they're gone for months or a year or something like that, and they've seen other people drinking alcohol and not having violence occur afterwards. So they've started to break the association in their minds between alcohol consumption and violence. But they go home to visit, they see their alcoholic parent consuming alcohol, and they have a spontaneous recovery of the fearful reaction. They're like, uh-oh, context is back. Haven't completely broken this association. You can imagine how this would affect the person's behavior very consistently at home when they're with those parents, so that their behavior might appear a certain way. Their personality may appear a certain way whenever they're at home visiting. Or if they're around people out in the world who are drinking alcohol, they may have reactions to that also. I'll get to that in the next set of terms. So some of these behaviors that we would say are part of a person's personality might have been classically conditioned and might be more consistently displayed in certain contexts than others, which is kind of one of the things about personality. You're supposed to be consistent across situations, but I think we all know that we don't all behave consistently all the time. I think we can all agree to that. So personality can't be just like a rigid blueprint. You have to act in a certain way. You have to. The fact that we can be a little bit flexible, maybe certain factors make us have unconditioned responses. You guys might be familiar with a term that is very popularly used right now called triggered, right? Or triggering. You can think of a classically conditioned stimulus as a trigger for a classically conditioned response, right? Like this is I've got this association that's so close that if the stimulus is present, my response is involuntary. So maybe that will help you to remember this kind of association if I use maybe more popular terms. Those aren't the ones that Pavlov used at all, but ones that you might recognize like triggering. Now, generalization and discrimination. All right, so let's pretend that the unconditioned stimulus is the passionate kiss and the unconditioned response is sexual arousal. Okay. Now, let's imagine that your partner for this passionate kiss always has onion breath. And it's a neutral stimulus because it's not necessarily meaningful. In fact, it might even be the reverse of passion to have onion breath. But you like your partner anyway, so you engage in a passionate kiss that leads to unconditioned response of sexual arousal. Ultimately, onion breath starts to become a conditioned stimulus where it can actually be arousing. If you've ever asked a person who dates someone who smokes, doesn't it bother you that, their breath tastes like an ashtray? And that's always the common question, isn't it? And it's like, have you licked ashtrays? But I think what they mean is what it smells like. But the thing is, what you're forgetting is classical conditioning, that cigarette breath can actually become a conditioned stimulus for sexual arousal. So it isn't always the case that just because it's like you would think you wouldn't like the smell or that it wouldn't be arousing, that it can't become a conditioned stimulus for sexual arousal. All right, so let's just accept my claim that ultimately you would make this pairing between the onion breath and the passionate kissing so that you start to produce a conditioned response to the onion breath. Okay, so let's use that as our model. Generalization says that we would have the same kind of conditioned response triggered by related stimuli. So if your partner always has onion breath and then one day shows up with garlic breath, might be close enough, it's similar enough, and trigger the same kind of conditioned response. On the other hand, discrimination says that we really respond only to specific stimuli. It has to be similar enough in order for us to produce the conditioned response. We don't generalize to just any old, flavor of breath. So like if your onion breath partner shows up one time having chewed Wrigley's double mint gum on the way over to the date, you may not have that conditioned response of sexual arousal because now their breath smells weird, like mint. So generalization and discrimination are terms that we use to describe those times when the learner extends their condition response to things that are similar enough to the condition stimulus. And discrimination refers to the times when the learner restricts their response, their condition response, to only those things that are similar enough to the conditioned stimulus. All right. So I've been using some words that I don't think Pavlov would like. Like I said the word mind in the previous video. He would not say that. He really underestimated the importance of cognitive processes. Here we have inventions we could really use. The dog and the cat are sleeping while the human is using the can opener. A lot of times animals that get fed canned food and the can has to be open with a can opener, have an association where if they hear that can opener, they come running to see what it is. It might be corn. It might be, I don't know what else comes out of a can. It could be, that you're not going to feed to the animal or that they wouldn't want. It could be anything, right? But the animal's like, oh, I'm getting fed. I'm getting fed. I hear the magic machine that gets me food. The fact that the animal can wake up from a dead sleep out in the living room because they heard the can opener implies they're thinking something, doesn't it? I mean, they have to get up and run over here and check. A lot of Pavlov's tests involved very involuntary behaviors like drooling or eye blinking or shivering, and didn't really test things like waking up, hearing something, running over, checking for it. So he was able to stay very focused on sort of automatic responses, but we see a lot of the mechanisms of classical conditioning underlying things like being able to get up and go check in the case of this dog and this cat, or in the case of the child who's raised by an alcoholic parent. Distancing yourself would be a good example of a cognitive process that might have classical conditioning, underlying it. Or a person who was raised by an alcoholic parent might generalize from their parents' behavior that anybody who drinks alcohol is likely to become violent as a result. And so then they may make decisions about relationships and other kinds of things that are very clearly, cognitive processes. So Pavlov really underestimated that and didn't talk about cognitive processes at all. Of course, I already mentioned to you that he wasn't a psychologist, so he really wasn't interested in that. He was really interested in trying to figure out the mechanisms that were causing this, involuntary response to the stimuli that he was presenting. He also really underestimated the importance of biological constraints. This is not my dog. I just found this on the internet where this dog is just, he's got quite the drool coming out of his mouth. It's easy to train a dog to drool. It's easy to train a rabbit to blink its eyes. It's really easy to through classical conditioning, elicit certain kinds of responses. And other kinds of responses would be harder to train through classical conditioning because it's not part of the biology of the learner. Humans are a little less biologically constrained. Like we can make associations in our, big fat cerebral cortex that other animals really can't do. Right? Like we're making associations between a lot of things as we move through the world that are probably classically conditioned, but just way more complex than what Pavlov was really capable or willing to talk about. So yeah, he's right with, if you're going to study dogs, then, there's probably not a lot to say about, their cognitive processes because they will drool. They can't help it. They don't, if you had that big strand of drool getting ready to fall out of your mouth, you would probably swallow. But a dog's not really thinking those kinds of things. They're not worried about how they present themselves. They're not worried about a lot of things. And so you can use their tendency to uninhibitedly drool to test your hypotheses. With a human, you might not be able to do that. The human might just swallow it, right? So Pavlov underestimated how much his model fit really well due to the biology of who he was studying. And that maybe had he tried to study humans, he would have branched out and realized that there was more to look at. All right, I want to spend a little time talking about the Garcia effects. So I'll see you in the next segment. We'll talk about the Garcia effect.